All right, so we are recording. So welcome everybody to our 6th annual Ortus Developer Week. I can't believe it that we have been on this for so long, since 2011. So very, very excited that this is our 6th year that we try to do this online conference. So very exciting. You can follow us at Ortus Solutions. We'll be posting all kinds of things during the week. And of course, our hashtag is ODW2017. So what is ODW? For you guys that have never heard of the ODW before, it is a free week-long online conference. As you guys know, we like to put on a lot of stuff for the community. This is one of those. It will be led by the Ortus team and several community members. All sessions will be recorded. They will be posted on our site, ortussolutions.com/ODW. And of course, we'll be uploading as many slides as we can to slideshare.net as well. Now, why do we do ODW? Well, we are firm believers in education and training. So this is one of our initiatives to basically improve the CFML and the Cold Fusion landscape. Expose not only the language, but also exposing lots of new stuff. You actually are going to be very privileged to see several of our new products that we are developing at the moment, several new modules that are on the roadmap, and several things around the Ortus stack. So very excited that this is kind of the first glance for several of the modules that we've been working on behind the scenes. And of course, ultimately to increase our community and adoption. Now, we are professional open source. This is how Ortus operates. We offer from training to support and mentoring, architecture and design, server tuning, web development, and sometimes mariachi singing is included. Again, we do this as part of our open source initiatives, but we always need sponsorships. So become an Ortus patron that will help sponsor all the open source development, keeping ForgeBox.io alive, all the documentation, all the downloads, and things like ODW. So as little as $10 a month, you can help us promote the language and promote all the things that we're doing. Our schedule is as follows. Starting today, we have 3 presentations. I did a little table there for everybody in the US and Central Europe, to at least have an idea of the times for our sessions. So we're starting right now from Pacific. It'll be 9 a.m. in Pacific, 11 a.m. the next session, and then 1 p.m. the next session. So 3 sessions a day. We've changed the format a little bit. Last year we did 4 sessions a day, but it was kind of out of hand. It was too much. So we reduced it now to just 3 sessions every day for 5 days, 15 sessions. And 2 announcements before we start. We have our CF Summit RESTful Services Bootcamp next week. So we actually just got our reservation today. So our spacing is very limited, because what we do is we actually rent out a full hospitality suite, which is pretty sweet. We have a full bar, we have full all stuff. So seating is definitely limited. So if you are interested in building RESTful services and microservices, Brad Wood and myself will be leading the training for 2 days in this awesome suite in the Mirage. So there's a discount code for you guys that are viewing here. Please register, because seating is limited. And then also our real life conference is next year, Into the Box 2018, April 25th to the 27th here in lovely Houston, Texas. So registration is open already. We have several awesome sponsors. Adobe as platinum sponsor, Mura is also sponsoring us, so very, very exciting. We have lots of cool little plans for Into the Box, and of course our traditional mariachi party will be on. All right, with that said, enough of the presentations and everything going on. Let's the show begin. So I'm gonna unstop my share here and give it to you, Eric, so you can take it away.
All right, can you all hear me?
I hear you.
Yes, we can.
And see my screen?
Correct.
All righty. We're ready to go. So welcome to the first ODW session. Glad to have you all here. This session is tips for writing modules for all frameworks especially for ColdBox. Excited to have you here. Let's get some expectation laid down. So I like to talk about what these talks are going to be and what they aren't going to be. So the first thing, what this talk isn't, this isn't going to teach you how to add that ColdBox module magic to implement in the framework of your choice or to come join us in the ColdBox land. This isn't going to do anything with UI modules. So modules that have their own routing, handlers, views, we're not touching those. We're concerned with modules that are just purely model and logic based. And I'm not going to give any suggestions on what modules you should write. I'm sure you have plenty of ideas, and I'm excited to see them on ForgeBox. What this talk is going to be about is how to build awesome modules for the entire CFML community to use, whether they are on ColdBox or Framework 1 or no framework even. We'll address a couple of those. And how to do it without losing all the special sauce of ColdBox modules, because it is special and it is awesome. So who am I? Why should you listen to me? My name's Eric. Live out in Utah, work for Ortus. I'm in charge of ForgeBox, the ColdBox Elixir, and I have this prolific module author here. If you click that link when the slides go up, I should have checked before. I think it was up in the 40s range. There's a lot of modules there. So that's my credentials for why you should listen to what I'm saying. And there's my lovely family this Halloween. They're awesome. On with the show. Let's do a quick overview of modules to begin with, in case you're coming from no framework or a different framework that doesn't have this concept. So what is a module? At its essence, a module is a reusable package of functionality. It's something so you don't have to write it yourself. You can utilize the community brain trust to have a problem that's already solved for you. That ranges from large libraries. You'll see one today for JSON transformation of your API, to small utilities like handling semantic version ranges. You don't have to redo it yourself. You can reutilize something that the community has already written and contribute back there. Modules are semantically versioned. That gives us the promise that we can get new functionality and bug fixes without breaking the public API of our module. The other benefit of modules is they can depend on other modules. So again, going down using the community and utilizing the work that's already gone forward, your module can depend on other people's modules. And lastly, there is a bunch of auto-loading functionality in ColdBox, so that it is as simple as installing the module to ForgeBox into your ColdBox application, and you'll have a bunch of new functionality already loaded up. Some examples of modules you don't want to write yourself. This is a shameless plug. QB, which is a CFML query builder. Come Wednesday and learn more about that one. CF collection, functional array programming that goes across multiple CF engines and gets rid of some of the idiosyncrasies. CB Markdown. If you ever wanted to parse Markdown in your application, don't do it yourself. Install this module. Or something as simple as a string utility library to help do some of the more annoying string manipulation, or even pluralization of strings, which is a pretty nifty feature of that. So there's a few plugs for some modules. As you can see, hopefully you wouldn't want to go rewrite these all yourselves. Instead, you'll jump on ForgeBox, you'll search for what you need, and you'll find something. So that's enough of the introduction to modules. Let's talk about cross-platform modules. Platform in this case being frameworks or no framework. So I'm going to jump to the end and then we'll go through it again. The too long didn't read version or didn't watch version is a good documentation and a good module config file. You're going to see me repeat these over and over again, but the biggest key to having your module adopted across multiple frameworks is to document all the pieces that need to be configured together, and then for ColdBox to tie those all together yourselves in your module config file so that ColdBox users aren't going to have to do the manual wiring up of your module. So, what platforms are we talking about here? I've listed a few. Obviously, ColdBox. ColdBox modules are what we're talking about here. These same modules can be used in CommandBox. So keep that in mind. That's another platform that your module can run in. A good example of those is if you make an API wrapper for something like GitHub or Twitter, you can use these in both places. Framework One has some even some basic ColdBox module support, which we'll talk about, which is kind of neat. CF Wheels, no framework. There's probably other frameworks too. All these tips will apply to how to write your module so that it can be used in all of these. So here's the problem. Coupling your module to ColdBox makes it harder to use in other frameworks. Now, what does coupling it to ColdBox look like? Well, here's some example code. It's for the most part, these come from just nonsensical examples that you wouldn't need to do, but it shows the point pretty well. A couple things to highlight: the singleton keyword on the properties, the interceptor service, which is, as you can, if you reference back to the Inject, is coming from ColdBox itself. WireBox as a dependency injection engine. All of these couple you to ColdBox by using ColdBox's implementation. But good news, with just a few changes, this can be used in any framework or no framework at all. Let's take a sneak peek at what that could look like. So this code does the same thing. We've switched from our property injection to a constructor. We're no longer injecting these, though, as you'll see later, ColdBox can still have that done automatically. We're using this null interceptor service, which we'll talk about the null object pattern and how that can clean up your code. And in the end, this can be used in any framework, and by configuring your module config file correctly, ColdBox users still won't have to do this manually. This really is the dependency injection principle in action. We're taking our dependencies, and instead of hard coding them in the file, we're telling the user that you're going to have to give me what you're going to use. Instead of saying WireBox is our dependency injection engine, we're making you give us one. It needs to respond to a few messages or methods, but other than that, you can give me whatever you want. So, an important reminder before we get into the tips in detail is that not coupling to ColdBox does not mean not using CommandBox. There's a lot of knots in there. Said a different way, you should use CommandBox. Every major CFML framework uses CommandBox and ForgeBox. So don't think when you're writing up these modules that you can't put this on ForgeBox, or that you should tell your users to download a zip file and extract it. Like, rely on these tools. You get all of those benefits of semantic versions of dependencies of your modules. So rely on these tools. Each framework has their framework code, have generator commands. Like, they are heavily invested in CommandBox and ForgeBox. So If you have dependencies on your apps, you need to document how they're used. We're going to talk about that, but if your module depends on another module, other frameworks, you're going to need to wire those together. So make sure to document it. Again, that's the biggest key here. Make sure you document how the code is used. So coming back to that example, you might be sad if you've developed a ColdBox module about taking all those things out. You might be asking, well, what about WireBox? How do I use Interceptors? How do I test this module now if I can't rely on the ColdBox framework giving me access to these? What about all those other cool stuff that ColdBox does that I don't want to have to do? Well, let's step through them one at a time. It's not as scary as it might sound, and you'll see with just a few tweaks how you can make your modules much more open. Let's start with WireBox. Specifically, let's talk about persistence. Persistence would be where WireBox stores the created instance. The most common persistence annotation you'll see is singleton, telling WireBox, I only want one of these for my entire application. As far as I know, there's not really a way to help other frameworks do this besides documenting it. So document it. Tell them that you should only need one of this component in your application. Maybe that's a manager class that creates your others, or a factory class. Also, keep the singleton annotation on your model for your WireBox users, or put it in your ModuleConfig, because those annotations won't hurt. They won't cause the code not to run. They just won't do anything for other frameworks. So this is one of those instances where ColdBox users, WireBox users really have some special magic that they don't have to worry about persistence. You can add it for them. Other frameworks, make sure to document the expectations. Moving on to dependency injection. Again, for the most part, your annotations will just do nothing. So this works. This is fine. This would run in ColdBox. This would run in other frameworks. It could be fine. The one issue in this case, if this is all the component looks like, is your users now need to have some sort of dependency injection engine. The reason why, stepping back, is there's no way to access this property, right? We don't have a setter method or a getter method on it. We're using some of the dynamic magic of Cold Fusion to inject this. And now if your users want to use this, they also need to know how to dynamically inject a property. DI engines handle this for us. They're great at it. And yes, we'd hope people would be using DI engines, but let's be kind and bring them into the future instead of just chiding them for not using a dependency injection engine yet. So the easiest way to get around this is, instead of property injection, I like to use constructor injection. Here, there's an annotation there on the constructor that's still injecting the mapping that we want for WireBox. I personally find it a bit cleaner to put that in the ModuleConfig file, which we'll show an example of. But this now can be used outside of ColdBox. If you don't like the constructor injection, you can use setter and the property injection together. So here that our accessors equals true on the component gives us an implicit getter and setter. So now you can document that users of this need to set a grammar before using it in this case. And that's perfectly fine as well. Again, make sure to document it. Here's just a silly example that says, to create it, you will need to pass in your desired grammar to the constructor, and you can call set grammar later. Just something that simple helps people that aren't using ColdBox get up and running. a point that everything you can do with annotations in your code, you can do in your module config file. So back to the example of our constructor injection, and we have that annotation there. Again, that's a little strange. Some of you might not like the fact that what looks like a code comment is injecting a dependency, and you don't need to do it this way. This would be how it looks like in a module config. I find this a bit cleaner. It works in my head. It definitely doesn't mean that this is the right way and that's the wrong way. It's just another way of doing it. So here, defining that mapping for WireBox and initializing the default grammar. So now ColdBox users can ask for this mapping and not have to worry about passing something in the constructor. So that's a little overview of dependency injection. To review, instead of relying strictly on property injection, add setters, add constructors, wire up dependencies in your module config. And that way you can have the best of both worlds with it being able to be configured without a dependency injection engine, but ColdBox users not having to worry about doing that manually. The last aspect of WireBox we'll cover is creating new instances. So this is, instead of injecting a single dependency, you need to create a new transient dependency or one-off dependency in your code. So option one is pretty simple. Use the new keyword. You might not need to use WireBox to create your new component. Here's a simple example. You just need to create a new one and pass it on. This might be your case if you don't need dependency injection inside whatever component you're creating. You just need a new component. This is perfectly fine and very usable to any framework or any vanilla Cold Fusion code as well. Option two, if you're needing dependency injection inside the class you created, you probably want to go use an interface. You can define explicit interfaces and require them in your code. I tend not to do that as it makes some dynamic things harder in Cold Fusion, but instead you can just have a documented interface. You can let people know that if you want to use this class, you're going to need to provide a component that responds to this method and acts like so. So obviously in the DI engine, it takes these arguments and returns the component that it should. What's nice about this is other DI engines, DI1 comes to mind, already has a facade method that acts like WireBox in this case. It takes this exact function signature. So by not coupling yourself to WireBox itself and by asking your users of your module to provide one, you open up the chance for other frameworks to just provide an adapter. This is what it would look like in your code. You're asking for this property, and then you call the method that you've specified in your interface. It looks very much like WireBox. That's how I would do it, is provide the interface for WireBox so that in my module config, I can just pass WireBox as this DI engine, and I don't have to do any more work on the ColdBox side. I don't have to write this myself. I'm just providing some documentation for other users so that if they want to use something other than WireBox, they know the interface to interface for that component. Again, you don't have to type hint it. In fact, I would say don't type hint it in general. It makes some dynamic things harder. But instead, just document it. Make sure to bring your own DI engine. Here's the interface. You can add in more semantics as follows. Again, documentation is 90% of the battle. If you can document how these pieces fit together, others can use it, and you'll have a better idea of how these things work together. wrapping up the WireBox section, let's just talk about a few gotchas. Avoid the on-di complete methods. They're neat, but they don't work anywhere but ColdBox. So if you're relying on something in it, that's not going to help somebody else. One option is to document that after you've created an instance, you have to call this on-di complete method. You probably can get away with something more explicit in your code that would make it easier to understand in the future. It's going to vary depending on your module, your use case. And then just to remember that going the old-fashioned constructor route means that everything needs to be injected. That's talking about using the new keyword or the create object call instead of the dependency injection. If you do that, there is no dependency injection. So that's weigh your options, weigh which one is right for your situation. And remember that the ModuleConfig can solve a lot of the needing to be injected part. So on the last one, if you decide that you need dependency injection, you need a DI engine, dependency injection engine like WireBox, and you need to document that in your code. So that's WireBox. Let's talk about interceptors. Interceptors are probably the feature that drew me the ColdBox initially. If you haven't used ColdBox or haven't used interceptors, I like to think of them as event-driven programming. It's a way to announce at certain places in your code that a certain event is taking place. And somewhere else in your code, you can announce that you want to listen for that event. A simple event in the ColdBox framework would be, pre-process. So before processing a request, you can write code that says, I want to listen whenever that event is fired, and I want to do something with it. Really neat, allows you to write code that's very clean and reusable, and it's a perfect use case for some modules. A couple examples of those modules would be, there is a verify CSRF token. The CSRF token stands for cross-site request forgery. It's a security measure to make sure that you're not submitting a form to another domain nefariously. And but if you're like me, I forget to put that in my code a lot of the time. And this module basically checks on every non-GET request for this token to be present automatically, so that you don't have to remember to put this in your controller or even litter your controller with this check. It will check for you. That's a great example of where an interceptor is really helping out, and it's nice to tie into that event without having to wire it manually up in your code. So ColdBox is the only one with this interceptor service, at least the way that we like to think about it. So what are our options? What can we do here? And these options aren't mutually exclusive. So we can follow the same pattern with an interface, right? We want to use interceptors, so we can provide an interface and the semantics for it. Give people the method signature, let them know that the semantics for calling this method is that listeners will then have a chance to act. That's putting a lot on other frameworks, and that's okay. We don't need to recreate the interceptor service for any other framework. We can leave that to them, or to, as we're going to see, to do something or nothing with it. So moving on to option 2, when you inject the service, you can check if it exists. So a simple is null, and I use this in some of my own code, sees if they didn't choose to configure this, then just skip this. Don't announce the interception point. This is basically check if ColdBox mode in my head is that if there is an interceptor service, go ahead and announce the interception. If not, then just move on. Nothing wrong with that. An option 3 is you can use what's called the null object design pattern. So the null object doesn't necessarily represent null the value, but it represents what happens when you have an object that should do nothing. So in this case, the null object pattern is going to let us have code that looks like this, where we take an interceptor service with a default to this null interceptor service. And in our code, we're not having to do any conditionals. We're just calling the code as assuming it's going to pass. That null interceptor service is super simple. It does nothing. It doesn't fail on the call. It just doesn't do anything with it. It says, okay, cool. Thanks for letting me know, and I'm done. So the benefit here is your module code can be pretty clean in the fact that you don't need conditionals, especially if you have multiple interception points. You can just write your code as if it was going to pass, and if somebody doesn't provide an interceptor service, we're just going to do nothing. So that's the null object pattern here, and those are a couple ways you can handle using interceptors still in your module while allowing it to be cross-platform. So again, you can specify an interface. I would suggest using the ColdBox interface and giving the semantics of that. You can throw a null object in there to allow your code to be very expressive while avoiding calling this for people who don't have an interceptor service. And I would say at the very least, you can wrap your calls to make sure that an interceptor service exists. If you think about it, this being quick tips, this is such an easy, add 2 lines, and now you've opened up your component to your module for other frameworks. If you didn't have the if check and somebody tried to run this and they weren't running ColdBox, this would just blow up. This would throw an error. That's not a very nice first experience, and it can really put somebody off from trying out modules or making them joining the community in that regard. People aren't likely to go source diving to figure out why your module didn't work. If it doesn't work the first time, they're just going to go find something else. They're going to go make their own. We're still kind of fragmented and not building on each other. So again, quick win to just throw an if check if nothing else around it. So, all right, testing. If you've used ColdBox, you might be aware that there is a built-in framework testing where ColdBox is spun up and you have access to the framework. You can do requests. You can use WireBox dependency injection, and that's really great. One neat thing, though, if you've structured your module in some of the ways that we're talking here, is you actually don't really need to run ColdBox for it. These are all testable without ColdBox, since you're not tying into any framework internals. One note, though, is, and this is getting into my opinions, you shouldn't need a lot of mocks and stubs just because you're not using ColdBox. Really, your module, you should be able to test all of your components working together, whether that's one or many, and get out the answer you need. The more mocks and stubs you have, the more you're not really sure this is, again, my opinion, not really sure if your code is going to work when it's put together. You're just sure that you've done good spell checking by typing everything twice. Now, you can include an integration and test with ColdBox as well, and I think this is a good idea. There is a CommandBox project called CB Module Template that helps scaffold out new modules, and it comes with the testing facility to test the current module you're writing. I always have at least one of these tests so that I can make sure that I've configured that module config file correctly. It's very easy when you go down this route of testing and you're just creating objects the good old-fashioned CFML way with the new keyword to ship without one of the mappings you thought you had. So keep at least one of these tests. make sure that your module config is configured correctly. But the rest of your tests are probably just normal extending from test box. So module authors, if you have a module out there, remember that the community is here to help you. You don't need to be an expert in all these different frameworks and how they're working. There's other people that are in other frameworks that want to use your module, and they are willing to put in the effort to make it hook into their particular framework. Module and then community members, remember, most modules are just a few lines of config away from being perfect. So maybe you're sitting here and you are a Framework 1 user and you're thinking, well, how do I put all this together? Well, let me tell you about a little case study, which is QB. QB is a CFML query builder. And we had a neat little experience with it. I wrote this specifically with ColdBox in mind. But in writing it, it just worked to use new, right? Just to create these objects with the new keyword, not have to go through any WireBox fanciness in the code. I left that for the module config. And then one day I saw a little blog post. Tony Junks wrote about integrating with Framework 1. Super exciting. I didn't know, it's fun to see something that you create take off and get adoption, especially outside of its normal community. So I knew that the next thing coming was interceptor support. I wanted a way to listen for queries being executed by this module, both before and after they were executed. And this blog post is what got me thinking about, well, how can I include both? How can I make it so that when I add this interceptor service, I don't blow up, people trying to use this in a different project? So that you've seen some of the fruits of that here in the tips about how to write that, and that's what's currently in the QB code base. Framework 1 integration is part of the QB docs. I think that's really neat. It was written by Tony. You can go there and see again, I think there's 8 lines of config. There could be a little bit more, but 8 lines, and QB works just as well with Framework 1 as it does in the ColdBox application. Even more neat to me is this kicked off a discussion about modules in general, and there is a basic module config support in Framework 1. So there's a lot of modules out there, some of the more simple modules that are just going to work, especially if you've followed the tips that we're talking about. It's going to work kind of the same way, which is just really neat for our community. We shouldn't need to have a ColdBox version of a module and a Framework 1 version and a CF Wheels version, right? We should be able to write one code base, and then we have these special configuration files. For ColdBox, that's module config. Who knows what it will be for Framework 1 or CF Wheels, but a file that basically maps vanilla Cold Fusion code into the environment and application framework. So one day our modules may ship with this configuration for multiple frameworks. I think that's super exciting. We are all better off when we support each other and we're using, and we're not split on silly issues. Regardless of what framework we use, the code in QB still writes queries the same. So let's wrap up here. Module authors, it's okay if you're not perfect at this, right? These are some tips to get you going. Remember that other people in the community in those frameworks that you don't use, they can help you with the details. They can send pull requests that make it easier for their framework of choice to use. And it's not going to hurt your code. It's not going to break your vision for your module. You can do everything you'd like to do with ColdBox and and they're module magic and support other frameworks or no framework at all. So it's okay if you're not perfect. The entirety community is here to help us out. So hope these tips help. If you have questions, jump in the Box Products channel on the CFML Slack. Hit us up, and happy to give feedback. If you see a module on ForgeBox that you're interested in and it's not working for you, contact the module author. You know, there's none of this I'm not sure how to say it. We all want to help. We want to make these things, these modules, this code work for everybody. So thank you, and I guess we can take any questions if there are any.